Thank you so much for having me. I'm not sure how groundbreaking this paper I'm going to present today is, but hopefully I'll bring some new facts and based on some of our recent empirical research. Okay, so the title of the talk sort of summarizes sort of what I was hoping to convey today, which is how China's re-centralization, so it wasn't centralized before, and I'll show you some evidence of that, and how that's affecting the economic development today. Okay, this is joint work with Kai-Chen Luo at MIT and also Xiaodao Wang, who was my longtime collaborator at U Chicago. So I want to start with a long-run debate in political economy and political philosophy for many, many decades. The starting point is that policy making is the core of any government. China is certainly not unique to that. There is a long-run debate about which level of government should be responsible for policy making. Okay, do you want the central government or the federal government to be responsible for the policy that's uniformly applied to the whole country, or do you want the local governments to come up with policies and then be applied to the local conditions? And there's going to be a lot of trade-offs that's being theoretically being proposed. Centralization in terms of policy making is going to streamline adoption. It's going to make spillover more likely to be internalized by local governments, and it's going to potentially enhance the overall efficiency of policies from the whole country perspective if it's being coordinated well. However, when you have a central government sort of making policies and uniformly apply policies to the whole country, it can also sacrifice the ability for local governments to adapt and potentially devise policies that might be suitable for local conditions that may not be suitable for other peer localities. Okay? And this has been sort of a long, really a sort of 70, 80-year debate within the political economy literature about which level is appropriate for policymaking. Now, we don't actually have that much empirical evidence anywhere in the world regarding how centralization in policymaking took place and what's the impact of that. And the two primary constraints for doing so in the empirical sense is that to measure policy centralization is not going to be a trivial matter. I'm going to show you sort of the example in China. You really have to sort of dig into every policy that's being implemented for the whole country and link them across time and across space to be able to make a statement about potential centralization. And that's going to be challenging for many parts of the world, and that limits the empirical evidence that has been accumulated so far. And second, linking policy, even if you have a way to measure centralization and decentralization, for example, and looking at whether that affected economic development or policy effectiveness, that's going to be challenging because you have to then link every single policy to the outcome the policy intends to achieve, and that's going to be a difficult matter to do it at a large scale. Okay. Now, we hopefully have some new advancements in the case of China. And for today, I want to sort of show you some evidence that we accumulated to help us answer three questions. And also, hopefully, this will be broadly informative to the long-run debate about policymaking and how centralizing policymaking should be. Okay? The first question we're going to ask is, for each government, local governments in China, over the last sort of 20 years, what constitutes the policy portfolios in the local governments? Where do these policy ideas come from? Did local governments come up with the policy themselves? Did they learn it from their peers, or did it come from the central government? Okay? And what's affecting this distribution of policy portfolio? What motivates potentially local politicians to implement or to innovate on policies? So that's the first question we're going to ask. The second question, sort of which is given away a little bit in the title already, is that is the trend of policy making, either centralized or decentralized, been changing in China over the last 20 years? Are things getting more centralized or decentralized? Okay, so I'm going to show you some evidence that things are getting rapidly and quite dramatically centralized in the last 10 years. The third question we're going to ask is that as policies are becoming more centralized, what had happened, or what's the implication of that to the overall economic development? Are the policies becoming less effective in promoting growth, and what's going to help us to extrapolate for the future as the centralization trend is potentially going to continue? Okay, so those are the three questions we're going to pursue. Now, to answer those questions, let me first introduce the database that we spent several years to build together, which really both highlights sort of the unique feature of China, where actually the abundance of data is existing in China that actually don't exist in many other political contexts, but also sort of the ability for this database to help us link policies across time, across space, and that we can measure centralization. Okay? So our goal here is to identify and trace all policies. This is going to be national policies and local policies. By local, I mean prefectural policies. That's the lowest level we're going to go down to, 333 prefectural policies that have ever been implemented in China during the course of the last 2 decades, starting from 2000. Okay, this is going to come from 2 databases. The first one is that we're going to take about 400,000 laws, regulations, and policy directives that has been issued by the central government over this time period. We're then going to combine that with about 3 million local government documents. Again, these are prefectural government documents, and also annual work reports. Okay? Now, just having those documents is not going to be enough to link policies. Actually, a lot of our time is being spent and try to take those policy documents and identify exactly the policy that's being implemented. Many policy documents might contain many policy ideas. So we're going to take all the policy ideas that's being implemented in the policy documents and then cross-link those policy ideas and policy sort of keywords and so on, so that we can trace where they come from, who implemented it, who learned it, and how they diffuse across time. Okay, so over this period of time, this is going to be the sample I'm going to show all the evidence on today from 2003 to 2023, this 20-year period. We identify about 115,000 distinct policies that has been implemented across the whole country. We can discuss a little bit later about sort of what's the definition of policies and different ways we can do so, but take this as our baseline approach. And for each of these policies that's being implemented in this time period, we're going to then trace back to see where these policies come from and then how it's being spread. Okay, so that's the background data structure. We think that this is comprehensive in a way that it should capture every single policy that has been implemented, even if it has been scratched afterwards, and there's a small minority of policies that's being scratched, it should have already been included here, and everything that's been happening down to the prefecture level. Okay? So the first question, the origin of diffusion of policy. The first Dallas facts I want to show and highlight is that over the long stretch of time, decentralization is a defining feature of the landscape of policymaking. Okay, so the exercise is the following. Let's take a city government, a prefecture government in a given year in China over this time period and ask, among that city government in a particular year, among all the policies that the city government has implemented in that year, where did that policy come from? Did they come up with the policy themselves? Did they learn this policy from another city governments? Or was that policy idea first introduced by the central government and it was trickled down to the city level? Okay? Over this overall time period, only about 18% of the policies that have implemented by local governments in China were initiated by the central government. In other words, the lion's shares of policies the local governments are doing were not coming from central government. They were initiated by the local governments and potentially diffused horizontally. Okay, so you get the feature of education policies such as tuition waiver. Those are central government policies. Central government get the idea, city governments implement it. Those are the policies that are part of the 18%. But policies such as domestic waste management, that's a real policy in one of our 150,000 policy sample. Those policies were not coming from the central government. Those are initiated by the Zhejiang government in 2007 and then spread across the country. Okay, so 18% were central government involvement. Now, if you want to push this back a bit further, in a given year, for a given local prefecture government, only about 2/3 of the about 2/3 of the policies were implemented by them that has never had any involvement by the endorsement by the central government. Okay, so they either invented this themselves or they were taken this from horizontal sources, and central government was not, for the entire life cycle of the policies, have any explicit endorsement. It was a very sort of bottom-up landscape. Okay, I'm going to come back to this a bit later, but if we can measure sort of when the central government endorses or issue a policy and look at how city governments or local governments are describing the same policy, the textual similarity about the policy features were in general very low, suggesting there's a lot of local tailoring and a lot of deviation from what the central government's initial first directive is, even among the policies the central governments are starting with. Okay? So decentralization is a feature. The second thing I want to mention is that now, who invented, or where does all these 80% of the policies that are invented, and who is potentially more innovative in the policy space? When I want to have a measure of policy innovation, we're going to take sort of a standard measure within the innovation literature to ask, for a given city in a given year, how many policies that you have implemented that's coming from a local bottom-up initiative? And I'm going to give you more credits of innovation if you are very early in the life cycle. If you're the first, you're really the innovator. If you're second, you're really close to being the innovator, but you're very early in the life cycle. We're going to penalize you if the policy that you have innovated never have any future take-up. So if you have a sort of obscure policy that nobody else wants to pick it up, even you're the innovator, we're not going to really call that innovation. If you innovate on the policy, you're an early sort of initiator, and then the policy has really wide diffuse, then that's potentially an important policy. We're going to give you a higher credit. So that's going to be our measure for each locality, each year, a measure of innovation. Okay? So it's going to capture some features such as you see a spike, for example, during Xi Jinping's tenure as a party secretary in Zhejiang, where the policy innovation during that time period is very high relative to the national average. There were actually a lot of policies that were first introduced in the locality during that time, and either later on become national policy, was a bottom-up diffuse pattern, or has been sort of diffused horizontally to many places. Okay, so during Xi Jinping's tenure in Zhejiang, it was actually a very innovative period for the local policy innovation. Okay? The natural question we want to ask next is that, is the politician more innovative? Among the more innovative sort of localities and time, was it the politicians who are very innovative, local politicians, or it was the place that are very innovative? Zhejiang is always innovative, or it's because something special about Xi at the time? Okay? So we can do a decomposition, and in economics we call this AKM decomposition, to say among the innovation metrics, we can decompose how much of that is coming from politician, how much is coming from locality effects, prefecture, and how much is coming from year-to-year fluctuation. So the basic sort of takeaway here is that the biggest explanatory component from innovation is the politicians. Okay? It's the individual politicians that matter more, explain more about how innovative you are on policies. Locality matter, but it's not that every single year and every single sort of party secretary in Zhejiang you get innovation. And also you sort of see a glimpse of that. There are year-to-year fluctuation, which is going to be important. That innovation trend is actually changing very quickly over this time period. Okay, so the second factor I want to highlight here is that it's decentralized, and politicians seem to have played a very important role in potentially fostering this policy innovation at the local level. The third thing about local decentralization I want to mention is that the decentralized policy making, especially policy diffusion, potentially going to have some distortions that's going to interact with local political competition in China. Here's an example. There's a well-known policy that's been studied by many in academia, which is the introduction of how to deal with congestion and private vehicle in large cities. Okay, so Shanghai have implemented a policy which is basically auctioning the license plate, which has been shown to fairly efficiently allocate the license plate to the individuals who have higher willingness to pay. That's overall a welfare-enhancing policy that also generated a large increase in the revenue due to the auctions. Okay? This explicit policy that was being shown to be potentially work very well was rejected by the Beijing government because it didn't want to give Shanghai the credit for coming up with this policy and it being spreading to many large cities. Beijing have come up with the free license lottery, which has been shown to be work inferior to the Shanghai auction version, but that's you have a notion of the policy that might have coming from emanated from a local locality may not diffuse if everything's coming from decentralized policy making, because local political competition or the ability for you to grab political credit may prevent some of the diffusion. This is in fact generally true. So if you look at this figure, on the x-axis, I'm pairing two cities, ranking by how similar they are socially, economically. Okay, so to the right, they are more close to each other. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you how similar they are in terms of the policy portfolio that's being implemented locally. Okay, so the positive correlation means that the two cities that are more socially, economically similar, the policies that they come up with or they implement or they learn from each other are also more similar, which means that there is going to be, in general, a tendency for you to learn and imitate other places that are very similar to you, because those are policies more suitable to your local conditions. Okay? On the other hand, if we were to map politicians based on their probability of being promoted and have a similar level of probability of being promoted, so they're in some fierce political competition, you see a downward sloping line, which means that the closely competitive politicians in those localities, their policy portfolio similarity is lower, which means that they don't learn from each other. They want to avoid each other's policy portfolio because they want to differentiate. And to the extent that many of the politically competitive localities are politicians are in the similar socially economically localities. So this avoidance behavior might make that you should have learned from that place. Beijing should learn from Shanghai in terms of vehicle auction, but they didn't because the political incentives. Okay, so that means decentralization doesn't mean it's always better. It generates a lot of innovation, but it has potential friction in terms of diffusion. Okay, so that's the first part. China was very decentralized in policymaking. Politicians played a very important role in forcing that decentralization. But decentralization doesn't mean it's always more better or effective. There are going to be frictions in diffusion that's coming from local political incentives. The second thing I want to show you is how does this look over the last during the 20-year period where we had the data. Does this trend, this overall pattern of decentralization start to change? Okay? Our anecdotal example seems to suggest things has becoming more centralized and local vibrancy and local innovation seems to be playing a less role. And we want to see whether that's indeed the case when we look at all the policy together. I'm going to show you three pictures here. The first one is that let's go back to the local government policy portfolio and see for a given year, for a given city, what proportion of policies that you implemented that's coming not from you or coming from your pure locality, but coming from directly from the central government. Okay, you're taking the idea central government come up with and you're just implementing it as a locality. The rate was hovered around about 30%, so about a third of the local policy portfolio was coming from the central government, and you see a pretty rapid rise to all the way to 45%, so that's about a 50% increase really sharply after 2013. The second picture I want to show you is that we can ask, when the central government come up with a policy, how many local governments actually implemented? Okay? It might, to your surprise, that for a long period, when the central government said this is a policy we want to implement, before 2013, only about 20 prefectures in China actually implemented the policy. It really decentralized in the sense that many central government policies didn't actually land to the local jurisdiction. And you see almost a tripling of that immediately after 2013, when now, over the last 10 years, when central government comes up with a policy, a lot of local governments are implementing it and implementing it in a very quick manner. Okay, so the central policies are occupying a bigger part of the local policy portfolio and are doing so in a faster way. The third picture I want to show is that if we were to measure central government policies, the policies central government have initiated, to the policy documents that the local governments have come up devised to implement the policy, and then compare the textual similarity between those two documents and to measure local tailoring, local differentiation, you see a very low level of similarity for a long period up until 2012, and you see a sharp increase afterwards, where even among the policies the local governments are implementing and potentially had a way to deviating beforehand, you see that's happening a lot less so. They're just implementing the central government policy and in terms of a package. Okay. Now, what might explain that change? Our hypothesis or our the primary evidence on this is that the entire incentive structure for political, given the politician played a very important role that I showed earlier, the entire incentive structure for politicians have changed over this time period. Okay, so let me show you two pictures. how to interpret this picture? So what I'm plotting here is that for each year in each locality, remember we have this measure of how innovative that locality in that year is. We can estimate whether that innovativeness is predicting of whether the local politician is more likely to get promoted in the subsequent period. Because you can think about this as a political incentive for being innovative. Okay, so we can estimate that year by year. And what you see here is that during the period before 2012, a positive coefficient that's being hovered around 0.1 is that being innovative is actually is politically rewarding, that it gets you promoted to the next level compared to all the other localities in a specific year. You see that start to reverse and start to jump back to zero, which means that as of today, being an innovative locality in terms of policymaking is no longer rewarded in terms of political promotion. You see the reverse of that is happening for political loyalty in the sense of we can instead of calculating political innovation, we can calculate how many policies you're implementing in a very quick and faster manner coming from central government, and call that sort of political compliance in terms of policy making. We see that that wasn't rewarded during the period before 2012. In fact, that was punished a bit in terms of promotion, and that started to get rewarded very quickly after 2012. Okay, so the bottom-up sort of innovation incentive in terms of political promotion seems to have really reversed and in a quite rapid manner in 2012. Okay, so that's the second part I want to end with. It was decentralized for a long period and over the last decade, and this seems to happen actually earlier than sort of COVID, where many of us had the feeling that local governments are not doing much. This is happening in 2012, and you see a rapid trend of this re-centralization, and the changing incentive structure of shifting away from innovation to compliance seems to play a very important role here. The third and final question we want to ask is that what does it mean for the economic development? Does re-centralization actually matter? And was it on net positive or negative for policy effectiveness? And especially want to take the lens from the suitability example, where local governments might come up with policies that are more locally suitable, but central government policy that force every locality to implement may not be as suitable to local conditions. Okay. So let me lay out some groundwork. Here, we're going to not focus on the entire universe of policy. We're going to focus on the subset of policies that are industrial policies. So because we can link each of these policies to the particular outcome that we can measure. For each industrial policy, we can link to the industrial output. We can link it to the patent. We can link it to the export of that particular industry. Okay. We can also then measure also the compatibility or the suitability of that particular policy to the local conditions. Is the local supply chain suitable for that industry to be taking place? Was other firms in the region suitable for that particular policy to be taking place? Okay. The first thing I want to show you is that when you have a policy that's being implemented in a locality that has higher local suitability, I'm here showing you the measure due to supply chain. Sort of, you have more places that are compatible for the upstream of the policy, relative to the localities who implement a policy that are less suitable. I'm plotting the differences here. In terms of generating export, sales, or patent in that particular sector, you see sort of the positive line after the policy being implemented, which means that it indeed is differentially beneficial to the local condition when you implement policies that are more locally suitable. This is, in fact, sort of a pretty robust finding. No matter what kind of suitability measure you use, you can measure by investment, you can measure by whatever, and you can measure also by a range of outcomes. That the punchline here is that it matters whether you implement a policy that are locally suitable or not. That the more suitability it is, the more sort of growth for that industry it generates. Okay. Now, centralization is going to potentially decrease that. So here's one stylized example. Before the wind farms were becoming a centrally endorsed policy, this was a policy that was being locally devised, locally initially invented. So in fact, Gansu was the local governments who invented the policy, who want to very largely incentivize a local wind farm. And there's a reason for that. The Gansu was in the region where there's a lot of endowment for natural endowment for wind, and Gansu should develop wind farms and so on. Okay? But you see sort of a couple of years later, after central government endorsed and want this policy to become a national policy and part of the centralization movement, you see many other localities, especially in the inland region of China, where there's no wind endowment, started to develop wind farms and adopting this policy. And that's part of what I mean by not suitable policies, where it's the exact same industrial policy that's being implemented, but it should have implemented Gansu. It should have been implemented in the western part of China where there is wind. It should not be implemented in the central part of China where there's not too much wind at all. Okay? You in fact see this overall that when a policy is becoming centrally endorsed by central government that push more localities to adopt it, there is a notable reduction in the overall suitability of the locality who adopt the policy to the local conditions. Okay, so it was suitable when it first was invented, but the centralization was really pushing the policy towards places that are not necessarily suitable. And to the extent that less suitable places adopting the exact same policy benefit a lot less from the same policy, this can be damaging for the economic development. And also think about sort of the opportunity cost that you could have implemented other policies that are more suitable, but now you're implementing a lot higher share of the policies that are not necessarily suitable to local conditions. Okay. The second part is, as I mentioned, there's also a downside for decentralization, right? Beijing did not learn from Shanghai, even though they should, on a vehicle auction plan. And centralization might be helpful to solve that. Centralization might say central government endorse the vehicle auction, and that might push all the governments to adopt, local governments to adopt the policy. That might actually mitigate some of the distortions coming from decentralized political frictions. So I want you to focus on the blue curve here. Again, I'm plotting sort of the similarity between two city pairs in a given year, how similar they are in terms of political competition, likelihood of being promoted to the next level, for example. And on the y-axis is a similarity in the policy portfolio. So the downward sloping line is the one I showed you earlier, which is before 2013, you see that places that are more similar, that are more political head-to-head competing, Beijing and Shanghai, they're not implementing the same policy, even though they should, because they want to avoid each other and not give each other credit. You see a flattened line after 2013 that Beijing and Shanghai actually now indeed implement the same policy, because after centralization, sort of that you don't want to differentiate. Being the innovative and sort of local politician don't get you rewarded anymore. You better be sort of more compliant on the central policy. That actually sort of reduce a lot of the diffusion friction that we saw in decentralized environment. Okay, so the question I want to ask is that on net, was the reduction in suitability after centralization, was the inland places taking the wind farm after central government endorsing wind farm, and reduction of the suitability outweighed this increase in suitability because centralization sort of pushed Beijing and Shanghai to adopt the same policy, which under the decentralized environment they wouldn't. Okay, we can do some sort of don't take these numbers super seriously, but we can do some calculation based on our estimates about how much the post-2013 centralization would have cost in terms of industrial output, export, and patent filing, and how much of it might increase due to the diffusion efficiency it introduced. What I hope you to take away from this exercise is that the cost of centralization sort of is a magnitude higher. It dwarfs the benefit. We're talking about close to a 5 to 10-fold differences. So the fact that sort of a lot of places that are getting policies that are not suitable, and then but they incentivize to implement those policies, but central governments wants those places to implement those policies, the cost of that way outweighed the benefit of having Beijing and Shanghai now start to learn from each other, because previously under decentralization they wouldn't. Okay. So let me take some time to conclude and sort of also talk about a few things I think we will learn from here. China was decentralized. It became re-centralized, and very rapidly re-centralized, and that seems to have a pretty dramatic economic cost because of a lot of policies that would have been effective if this goes to the right place are no longer so, and that's damaging the overall economic growth opportunity. I want to make two additional broader points. The first one is on the methodology. The first bullet point here is that China is actually quite unique to facilitate research like this, where you actually have very comprehensive large databases on policies that you wouldn't be able to do for many other sort of governments. So apart from sort of trying to understand policymaking in China, but if you want to think about policymaking overall speaking across the world, China is one of the best places to do a rigorous study on a given sort of, you would take many, many more years to collect such data for the US, for example, or even for smaller polity. And China's policy data is actually quite clean, quite comprehensive, but maybe it's feasible to clean. It was not clean to begin with. The second point is, this centralization pattern that I showed you actually doesn't show up in a more naive aggregate number. Okay, so if you just simply go in to say, did central government issued more policies after 2013? Did central government sort of implemented more of this, more of that after 2013? Many of these aggregate sort of simple number you can get just looking at the summer statistics actually wouldn't show a jump as dramatic as I showed you earlier. You really have to look at all the policies, and in particular, link these policies to the localities, link it to the particular politicians, because they're the ones their incentive that has mattered and changed. And you start to then see this really rapid and quite trend-breaking trend in 2013. Okay. Now, what does it mean for China and its future? The first thing I want to mention is that I think what a lot of I think is the engine of China's growth over the last sort of 40 years, which is a decentralized system with a lot of innovation by the local politicians, and politicians are hyper incentivized to be innovative on that. That may have been the day of the past. And going back to the title of Laboratories of Autocracies, this is comparing to the notion of federalist system and laboratories of democracies. I wanted to make the point that you don't have to have democracy to have local policy innovation, policy learning. If the incentives are correct, which is during the period of 1980 to 2012, there were a lot of incentive alignment to let local governments to do their own thing and be innovative, and that seems to be very effective at generating growth. But on the other hand, that incentive can really turn and shift quite rapidly, and there doesn't seem to be any trend of going back. The second part I want to highlight is that if you take this these facts sort of seriously, then it seems to be able to explain why you have national breakthrough on some industries, because centralization is pushing certain industries. And you have sort of overcapacity because not only does central government push for industry, many localities that would have done something else are pushing or rushing into that industry are also doing it. So you have quote unquote the overcapacity in certain industry, but also quite sluggish local growth, because those local governments could have done something that's more locally suitable, but they have been rushing into doing things that central governments are deemed as a national priority. Those three things I think are all part of the same story here. We might have vastly underestimated sort of the overall effect. We don't have any way to measure, and that might have been sort of the bigger chunk of the loss in opportunity is that there would have been a lot of policies that get innovated by local governments that never get innovated in the last 10 years, because local governments are now no longer spending time on policy innovation, but they're spending time on implementing policies coming from the central government. And that can be even more damaging if there's a way to potentially capture those sort of policies that never existed but would have existed had there's no such centralization. Okay. All right, thank you very much.
Excuse me while I try and click this other thing on. Well, Mark said at the beginning that this was a ground-breaking paper, and he's quite right. It's actually a brilliant paper with a number of key insights about the political economy. For me, what is important is it provides strong empirical evidence to various aspects of the political economy that we political science folk have often argued from a kind of single case basis, or that we've gleaned from anecdotal encounters. So in that sense, this is an extremely important paper. I had some questions and some comments about it. As David said, China lends itself with these mountains of data to this kind of research. One of our PhD students here, Yeling Tan, used the same method of searching with keywords through documents at the central level, at the local level, to explain why there was variance in the implementation of WTO standards that the national government had signed on to. So I think that way of being able to do this keyword searches through official documents is certainly an area ripe for many kinds of research that we could undertake. I had some comments. The first is it possible with the data that you use to make a distinction between the policy priority for the central government and then whether local government initiates or whether local government follows? So I would imagine, for example, around family planning, you won't see an awful lot of local initiative. You might see implementation variation, but I suspect it's going to follow pretty closely. Secondly, you might not think the central government is going to get involved in wastewater collection in Zhejiang province, and so yes, you would expect that to be carried out by the local Zhejiang authorities. But what I wonder there is, does the general sort of direction from the central government implement what local governments will begin to do? So, for example, we know at a certain point the central government started talking about policies around clean water, about environmental cleanup. Is that then a signaling that local governments, yes, the initiative comes from there, but they've taken a kind of signaling from the central government itself? Would be a second issue I would raise. The third thing that actually really causes me to wonder, and this is more about research that I've done rather than what you've done, that if so many of these initiatives are local, it seems to clash with what we found in the surveys that we did in citizen satisfaction from 03 to 2016, before we were stopped from doing them, that satisfaction clearly dropped as one got to the local level of government, with higher levels of satisfaction for the central government. But interestingly, surveys which we could conduct after Xi Jinping took over in 2012, satisfaction at the local government level improved. You're a statistician, economist, so tell me, why is that happening? It seems counterintuitive in terms of the story you're telling. But I want to look at some of these issues from political science perspective, and a couple of points related to that, and a question that I'll come back to at the end. And this tension between central control and decentralization is a perennial issue in CCP history. It goes back before 1949, after 1949. And I think this relates to your findings about economic growth, but that might not be what is in Xi Jinping's mind driving this, which I'll come back to, is that the party has always proven to be the most successful when it has adapted to local conditions. And the precarious nature of survival, for example, has also meant before 1949 that local politics usually adapted to meet local conditions. So one can contrast the failure of the Jiangxi Soviet in the early 1930s, when it followed central directives from Shanghai, which of course came from Moscow, led to disaster. And you compare that to the flexibility that was shown in the rural base areas from the late 1930s and 40s. I always think Peng Zhen, who people think of as a very conservative, law-minded individual, is a great example. When he was leading the Jinqiaji, one of the base areas, he rejected the viability of building state-owned enterprises, part of party policy. He rejected the viability of building state-owned enterprises in the countryside, responding that it's like trying to build a skyscraper on shifting sands or painting a cake to prevent hunger. By contrast, he talked about small and medium businesses, saying, if it gives milk, it is mother. So, as your paper shows, Xi Jinping's approach to governing the tension between the central directives and local adaptation stands in stark contrast to what we've actually seen before, and by implication, what Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin had been pushing. And they, of course, accepted the need for greater flexibility in what I think amounted to a softer form of authoritarianism. And again, I think what your evidence shows empirically is what many people have noticed about local experimentation and social initiatives providing much of the dynamism for growth and development. And again, as I've said, the party has suffered from overzealous central directives that have driven localities to adopt policies detrimental to their own environment. Just one anecdote, when I was a student in China in 1976, we visited a number of different rural areas. And one of the things that struck me was going to a couple of rural areas where they had beautiful prime farming land, and they dug it all up to make terrace fields. Why have you done this? Well, we're studying the Dajai Jingshen. We're studying the spirit of Dajai, which of course is where they carved terraces out of the mountains. And I said, I don't actually think that is really what the Jingshen of Dajai really means. I think it really means trying to do the best with your local conditions, not ripping up prime farmland to make terrace fielding where it's not necessary. I thought again what was really important in the paper is the role that local officials play in promoting local initiatives or pushing through the centrally mandated policies. And as you say, quite rightly, it's driven by the incentive system which has undergone significant shifts, as we know, for the evaluation of officials since Xi Jinping came into power. The last thing I want to finish with is an interesting question and puzzle, because one of the things you show is the importance of individuals. And you talk particularly about Zhejiang being innovative when Xi Jinping was there, and one would presume, given that you're talking about that it's often the role of the official rather than the environment, that Xi Jinping must have been very open to local initiative and innovation. So then the question really becomes, where you talk about the economic cost of centralization substantially outweighing benefits, is why Xi Jinping has pursued centralization so vigorously, given his experiences in Zhejiang and so forth. And I would suggest there's two main reasons for that. The second of which comes to your last points of conclusion, and whether they are so important for Xi Jinping or not. Now, obviously, when Xi Jinping took over power, he saw a China that looked a mess and that threatened continued Communist Party rule, endemic corruption, rising inequality, society and local governments pursuing their own agendas, as perhaps your paper suggests, often contrary to the intent of the national government and the party. In addition, as the paper notes, it does provide offsetting benefits. You talk about mitigating distortions, inefficiencies of competition between local governments. I think the Shanghai-Beijing case is a great example. I grew up in South London. We would never do anything that they do in North London, just on principle. But I think most importantly, I think, is that Xi Jinping sees it as the most effective way to shift the development strategy. I think you allude to that effectively. Xi wants to shift the model of development to high-quality development with a focus on the real economy, made in China 2025, dual circulation. So Xi's focus is on high-quality development, where he prioritizes innovation, sustainability, and balanced growth, rather than the speed of growth. Now, your paper would suggest that it's undermining the prioritization of innovation, but perhaps that's not the kind of innovation that he's interested in. I think his approach is that he hopes the high-tech sectors will replace the lost export markets and real estate, and I think he's willing to accept short-term pain to build long-term self-sufficiency. And that entails, of course, a high cost of investment and the kinds of inefficiencies that you're talking about and waste in duplicate projects. But I think from his perspective, it is successful. And I think some success from his perspective can be shown. The high-tech value-added production is now outpacing overall manufacturing. And in 2024, what one might call the new economy had actually grown to 35% of China's nominal GDP growth. So I think we're left with a kind of puzzle and a conundrum there from Xi Jinping's previous experiences and what he's implementing there. I don't know if you want to respond to any of that or whether we open to questions and then respond to everything together. Up to you.
maybe I'll say something brief to your comment. And thank you so much for Tony for your comments, and it's all fantastic. I want to mention sort of 2.5 points on the things that you mentioned. The first one is, which I didn't have time to spend to talk too much about, which is there is this whole direction of local initiative which means that local governments come with the idea, and central governments then subsequently learn. So the vertical transmission has another direction. So that's about a fifth of the policies. So the fifth of the local initiatives eventually sort of become a national policy. So you can think about these as central governments are learning from how to do certain things that they might not think about wastewater management, and some local governments sort of come up with it, and then eventually become a national policy. So there's that which I didn't feature here. The two additional things I want to mention is that I want to caveat on our assessment that everything I showed you about sort of the benefits versus costs was evaluated under this lens of policy become less suitable to local conditions and so on. And as you alluded to, there could be many other objectives that push for centralization, which we don't necessarily have a way to evaluate. There are several things that we have looked at. For example, so you can think that forget about local stability. Central governments actually just want to push industries that have high economy of scale. That shouldn't local governments adopt it. It should just be a national policy because the economy scale is large. We have a bunch of those, and we actually don't see any evidence that the policies central governments are implementing have a larger potential for economy of scale. The only place we find some evidence that can justify central governments pushing for certain policy is that the industry that are subsequently being subject under import-export control, those are potentially strategically important sectors that are more disproportionately being pushed by central government rather than local initiatives. So there are going to be some externalities there, alternative objectives that we certainly are not comprehensively evaluating. The last thing I want to mention is that sort of 1.5 thing I want to mention is that what I find it potentially sort of worrisome is that it's not because this pendulum has shifted from centralization to decentralization. The central government is just doing a bit more in some years, and then they care less about local, and then vice versa. I think what's potentially worrisome is that it's precisely because the incentive structure has changed. It was already a pretty delicate incentive structure where you put promotion based on economic performance. It was never written down. It was a norm that takes years to establish. And this norm gets completely shifted to the other norm, and to return to the decentralization environment where you're then return to the environment where letting local governments are being incentivized to innovate. That return is potentially infeasible, and even if it's has to implement, it will take many years to reestablish that. I think the paradox which you caught about Xi Jinping exactly was that he was sort of by far, during that period, the most innovative person, and he knew that was a period where innovating was rewarded politically, and so sort of in some sense, he definitely know how the game was being played, and he sort of a shifting incentive right after. So I don't think it was necessarily a coincidence that sort of an innovative person during the period where innovative was rewarded went back to, and also to give maybe not complete sort of bash on the centralization. It's justifiable that if you come to the central government and see when the central government endorses a policy, only 10, 15 local prefectures are implemented. That does not seem to be the right place to be either. So the question is sort of how far you want to move to the compliance model, and one might argue he had moved too far on that scale.
Great. I guess for Xi Jinping, it would have made him much more attractive to become the general secretary of the party if other people thought he would be innovative, he might be imaginative. And I think it probably underpins a lot of the mistaken sort of rumors and expectations that sort of flowed around with Xi Jinping taking power, that maybe he'll be China's Gorbachev, maybe we'll see another phase of opening, and we got something which is very different, because as you say, maybe the incentives shifted entirely. It is a brilliant paper, and there's an awful lot in there. It's also very long, I warn you, but a lot of those are tables, 91 pages. But let's open up the floor, and I think there's a microphone, so if you have a comment or question, please just let us know who you are, and I think the gentleman here. to start with?
Thank you. Ray Guo from Fairbanks Center. I'm a visiting scholar. Thank you, Professor Yang. It's a great paper. I have two questions, one technical and the other, I'm kind of, your paper provides inspiration in many fields. So, I want to kind of your help connecting some of the dots. So one technical question is about how do you measure the differences in national policy and local policy? Besides the keywords, as Professor Sage just mentioned, sometimes even with the same kind of keyword, the local policies may kind of do something really different from what the national policy provides. I wonder whether you have, control in measuring how similar or different they are. So that's a technical question. The other question is, my field is law. So in the research of Chinese constitutional law, there's specific research on the physical power between the central and the local government. One relevant fact is that probably post-2013, with the collapse of the real estate industry in China, the local government just lost their local main source of their local revenue, and consequently, the aside from probably 6 provinces or cities in China, most of the other provinces, local provinces, they basically got transfer payment from the central government to the local government, and the way that the transfer payment work is that it's often the local governments would go to different ministries to apply for project money. And a condition for that is that sometimes they have to set up local compliance office, definitely a procedure, and they have to meticulously follow some of the directives that the central ministries give to the local. With that as a background, post-2013, a lot of the money goes to the local governments with all these constraints. And I wonder, is that the main factor for the local to lose its sort of local innovative different policies and converge to the national policy? So I'd appreciate your comments on this. Thank you.
Should we collect a couple? Or
Yeah, why don't we take, if there's any other immediate questions, and then we can pull them together. There's here. Yeah, and then up at the back in the middle.
Thank you, Professor Yang. My name is Yu Sheng. I'm this year's N1 postdoctoral fellow at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. I have a question. So from your research, to what extent do local bureaus or governments have the incentives or the agency to reconcile the so-called high-quality, innovation-driven, industrial policies versus, some of the underground issues and problems, such as like youth unemployment or like social inequality issues. So to what extent do the local government, they have the incentive to reconcile these two, these two forces? Thank you.
Then I think there was a person in the middle at the back, and then perhaps take these.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your fantastic lecture. And I'm a visiting scholar of Harvard Indian Institute. And I just, because I work on the history and maybe my field is more humanistic and different from the social science. But, due to my life experience, I'm very curious. And I was raised up in Gansu province, as you mentioned, and I studied in Zhejiang province, and now I work in Tianjin. So maybe from a Chinese perspective, we have, the regional differences. For example, for my hometown, Gansu province, we are more conservative. I think the political or the culture context is more conservative, and it's, we would, follow maybe the central government or the policy, at a larger scale. But for, Zhejiang province, because I studied in Zhejiang University, and I found, the local atmosphere, maybe the people or the both, the government, the politicians, they have the open mind. But in Tianjin, it's, according to my observation, they are more bureaucratic because we are so close to Beijing. So I wonder, have you ever considered, the variation of the culture of the variation of local culture of the political context on the implementation of the central governmental policy? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me answer those questions. Thank you for this great question. The first one, policy sort of merging. In fact, this is what took us like sort of several years to do so, because we started with policy keywords, and in fact, each of the 150,000 sort of policy clusters were manually checked and so on. So that was a very labor-intensive period. And then ChatGPT got sort of released at some point. We tried to do this with large language model, and it turns out it's a lot less perform a lot less well than sort of actually sort of you need a lot of contextual knowledge to do so. There's a lot of issues that you mentioned of, we are not distinguishing between if your local governments are implementing an EV tax subsidy of 5% versus EV tax subsidy of 6%. That's the same policy, okay? If you call an EV subsidy, if you call this another whatever name, but really it's EV subsidy, that's the same policy to us. However, an EV subsidy versus an EV tax breaks, those are going to be two distinct policies. But you can see there's going to be a lot of decisions we'll have to make along the way, and this is the baseline version, and we'll have several versions to make it more aggressive to group policies or less aggressive. And our hope is to eventually make this publicly available so one can sort of use whatever version that you need for your own research. The second question you asked is what are the local policy transfer? One thing that I didn't have time to show is that you see this change or centralization after 2013 happen sort of ministry by ministry. So in terms of policy domain, after the particular ministry has established the work group unit where Xi Jinping was the head. So in that sense, like it seems to be really a top-down changing political incentive type of situation. Certainly, I mean, he wasn't sort of the work group leader for all policy domains, but it seems to be a lot has to do with the incentive, not from the constraint that you mentioned. The local government's incentives. That's a great question. I think the magic of the quote unquote old model was that you mean the central government doesn't need to care about how local governments do things. All you need to care about is that I want to promote the local governments that deliver the highest local growth, subject to not having a lot of protests, subject to not having a lot of pollution. That was a simplified version of the promotion formula. And then you devise your own policies to achieve that. You find your own local compatible sort of policy mixtures that satisfy high growth, minimizing the protests and minimizing pollution, which take care of the unemployment and so on. And then you just need to figure out how to measure this and promote. But now it's incentive, and local governments are incentivized to figure out what will be the best policy to achieve that. And that was the old version. And now the new version certainly is no longer doing so. To your question about local culture, so it's a great question. I mean, let me explain maybe slower about the decomposition that we did, which is precisely try to do so. So when I say that it's the local politician that played an important role in explaining innovation, not locality, what we're essentially saying is that across all the time period, across all the localities in China, and we're looking at the variation where a Gansu local politician who were at a place that you may not associate with a lot of innovation, when that person moved to a place that would have had a lot of innovation and moved to Zhejiang, was a similar level of innovation or not? Did the Zhejiang local government, when moved to an inland places where innovation was on average a lot lower, do the same level of innovation carried over when that person was working in the previous place? And that moving, that would require every politician to be moving to a multiple location for us to be able to estimate this decomposition. And that's where precisely taken care of. We're not saying that on average Gansu might be less innovative, but it's that a Gansu innovative governor, when that person goes to another place, that person is still innovative. When Zhejiang governor, party secretary who was innovative in Zhejiang and moved to places to Gansu, the Gansu was differentially innovative during the period when that governor comes. So that's where we think that a lot of the external power is coming from the politician, not from local effects in that sense.
Great. And I'm sure a lot of graduate students will be pleased to hear that ChatGPT couldn't do as good a job as a research assistant, which is a major concern. Anyway, let's go to the next round. We have 1, 2, 3, and then 4 at the back. Let's take those 4 together. That might fill up the time.
I'm Wen Jian, and I'm a visiting PhD student from Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you for your presentation. It's a very fascinating study. My question is, policy originating from different levels of governments and of different issues varies in their economic, political, and social importance. For example, like policy innovation in waste management is quite different from policy innovations in like petition system, which is quite important for the political stability. So my question is, when marrying policy innovations, does every policy have the same weight or different weights?
Okay, that was yours.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Alex. I'm a senior at the college, and I apologize if I missed something in the methodology, but my question is, did you look kind of at provinces at all as their own units of centralization, kind of as compared to the prefecture level? And if not, do you have any kind of hypotheses as to what that relationship would have looked like?
Bill Xiao, I'm an economist, retired professor here. I have a question. In 2003, Hu Jintao, actually, that's a period, your 20-year period, made a major pronouncement in People's Congress that China going to walk with 2 legs. China is not only going to pursue economic development, but add on a leg of social development. In my view, that changed the whole decision-making in China, because now local government as well as central government have to make the trade-off between economic growth and social programs, like eradicate, let's say reduce poverty or inequality in China. How would that policy, which Hu Jintao pronounced in 2003, that's in public record, but it takes a decade before it got implemented because Jiang Zemin was against it. How does that affect your analysis or comparison, how effective the local government able to or unable to implement the central government's directions?
And then I think at the back there.
Thank you, Professor Yang. I have 2 questions. First, I'm wondering if you can say more about the changes in the incentive structures in addition to the well-known change of the political tournament. And my second question is, I'm wondering if you can say more about the variations across policy domain, in the sense that in what policy domains the local governments are more likely or tend to show more autonomy, and in what policy domains they are tend to be more compliant.
Can you let us know who you are, please?
Yeah. So I'm I'm a PhD student from the philosophy department here.
Great, thank you so much for these. I think the first and the last question actually were similar in terms of policy priorities and policy domains, and which is also actually your question, which I skipped. There's definitely there's definitely a notion that, well, let's start with a simpler one. There's definitely a notion that there are certain policies that local governments have no jurisdiction over, foreign policies, defense policy, and so on. So those are out of the picture. Now, among the policies that local governments could have jurisdiction over, but central governments also, sort of what's the overlap and what's the relative parity. Now, we don't have a perfect measure, but there are things that we could measure, which is sort of whether a policy showed up in central government's 5-year plan, whether it was, what's the relative weight it played in the local government's policy document, where sort of how much it occupied the local government's work report, and to reflect their importance. For economic policies, we'll have a better measure. For example, we can say among all the economic policies, what are the policies that would have generated higher growth looking at other parts of the world? So if you have reached sort of the steady state in the rest of the world, what's to capture the potential? And then among all the economic sort of sectors, which are the policies that you would have potentially want to put more weight on? I'm not saying that sort of wastewater is not important, but like across all the sectors, there are certain sectors that are going to have a higher share of the growth or the pie, and that we can measure. We see some glimpse that sort of the more when central government puts policy in a 5-year plan, local governments are implementing it. That's very strongly predicting diffusion, but that's a very small share of the overall policy we're talking about. Now, among the other measures of priority, we don't see a very strong sense that it's the quote unquote more objectively important policy that gets sort of more centrally involved and so on. If anything, we actually see a lot of local governments coming up with policies that are much more economically important or has high economic potential. The second question, province hierarchy. Yes, that was a good question. Here, I'm doing things more naively, which is I'm treating prefectures. I'm treating everything as flat. If there's central, there's local. Local is prefecture. Occasionally, sort of provincial government issue policies that we cannot link to a particular prefecture, and then we just treat that province as a standalone unit. We can definitely start to think about sort of a 2-tier hierarchy system where province act as its own player and how that interact. That's something we haven't done, but it's definitely conceptually super interesting to think about. Promotion incentives and competing objectives, as your question. So if you remember the figure I showed you on what's the relation between being oh, actually, sorry, I should put on the background. We can also sort of recall the picture I showed earlier about how innovative you are in a given year and how likely you get promoted in a given year. And you see sort of actually, in fact, during this period, a trend upward that innovation gets rewarded more after 2003, and then it sharply went back down. We can do the same exercise for GDP, local GDP performance, and how that predict growth. Predict promotion. Up until today, there's a lot of noise, and so which means unexplained variation in who gets promoted and who doesn't get promoted. But GDP still remain as one of the key predictor for promotion. So in that sense, the tournament structure is still very much in play. And you can do sort of more sophisticated estimation that is the GDP tournament sort of incorporating some of the social issues that are being explicitly mentioned, such as pollution, such as unemployment risks, and so on. That has remained sort of fairly stable over this time period, and you start to see some drift downwards in the last 5 years. So that seems to have become less predictable for promotion or explaining promotion, and that's linking back to the incentive structure. It used to be that I have a lot of other potential competing objectives, but it is the case that if I'm just do peer-to-peer comparison, whoever delivers the highest growth, controlling for protest occurrence, controlling for pollution incidences, that individual gets promoted at a much higher probability, and that remained true for the time period until the last about five years or so. And on top of that, you get rewarded more so for innovation. That for the innovation can get you more growth, and even for the same level of growth, if that's a result of a policy portfolio that's more innovative, for the period in 2003 to 2013, it gets you an actual boost in promotion probability. So I guess to answer your question is that I don't see sort of a structural change right after Hu Jintao's announcement of this in 2003. Now, you could say that sort of the 2013 change was a decade-delayed version of what happened before. No, to be frank, I don't think we have nailed exactly what happened after 2013. Sort of, what is the institutional change that has apart from the work group being established, that has seemed to have shifted. But the overall picture, while we know the change seems to happen maybe 5 years earlier than what I have thought it was during COVID period, this happened before that. I don't think we nailed exactly what was the political institutional change that generates such a sharp shift per se.
Can I make one comment on that to your question, Bill? I mean, what I've often found, because we know local government officials are only going to be there 3 to 5 years before they move on or change their position. maybe some of the line agencies is a little different. But what I often found talking to local government officials was, you know, I've got 3 to 5 years. GDP can be measured. Health improvement, that's going to, you know, or educational improvement, that's going to exceed my period of being an official here. So I think it kind of gets downgraded, and so you still get this re-emphasis back to just sort of crude GDP, and if there's other priority events. Sorry.
Yeah. No, certainly I don't want to be the one who defend GDP as a metric for social development overall speaking. But the nice part of GDP is that to make this part of the incentive structure, you need to have something that's measurable and frequently measurable to tie the incentive to it. And many other things that either there's a delay from policy to the outcome, or there's very little way that you can actually objectively measure. And not only measurable, but it has to measure from the central government. They cannot be sort of reported by local governments, where local governments, obviously, if I tell you that you have to report on this number to me because your promotion depends on it, you're not going to get the objective number.
And then there was the last questions there, and I think we'll have to wrap up. The gentleman there who had a couple of questions.
Oh, the policy. So I think partially the answer is that, you know, we don't see that much. So a lot of the pattern I showed you about the 80% split and so on is actually fairly true across all the policy domains, apart from the few examples where the local governments have no jurisdiction over. Even for domains such as finance policies, where a lot of the policy making were at the central government level, local governments are implementing a lot of their own version. So many of the things I showed you are not qualitatively different across policy domain. We should have done more about sort of the domain heterogeneity to show you, but yeah.
Okay, well, we actually have reached the bewitching hour, so please join me in thanking David again for his presentation. That's fantastic. No. It really is a great paper.